On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the Prime Minister, Minister for National Security and the Public Service, and Minister of Finance, Economic Affairs and Investment of Barbados for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort Her Excellency. The Assembly will...
Actuellement chez Coolblue, les offres irrésistibles. 2 semaines de deals intéressants sur des tas de produits.
Development of the economy, but it diminishes the inflation risk.
Является для снижения инфляционных рисков.
Putin said he saw no problems with the ruble's fluctuations as authorities had tools to keep the currency and market under control. The ruble hit its strongest level in almost 6 weeks against the dollar on Tuesday.
For the defense of the homeland. In Burkina Faso, we have 58,000 such volunteers, of which 40.
I now give the floor to His Excellency Bassolma Bazie, Minister of State, Minister of Civil Service of Burkina Faso.
Excellency, distinguished President of the 78th session of the UN General Assembly, distinguished Secretary General of the United Nations, distinguished participants, on behalf of His Excellency Captain Ibrahim Traoré, President of the Transition Head of State, I convey to you the warm greetings of the people and government of Burkina Faso. On behalf of the Burkinabe people, I pay a humble tribute to the memory of those great world leaders who embodied the hopes and dreams for a just world through and sacrifice. Of Mali, Ruben Nyobe and Félix Moumier of Cameroon, Sylvanus of Luther King and Malcolm X of the USA, Nelson Mandela of South Africa, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Cabral of Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde, Marian Mugabe of the Republic of Congo, Captain Noel Isidore Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, and others. These leaders were largely executed violently. Others were assassinated. They died in prisons or from poisoning. Their only crime in each case was embodying the dreams, ambitions, and hopes of the peoples that have been killed, raped, trampled, and pillaged. Mr. President, my presence at this august podium before the UN on behalf of Burkina Faso, country of upstanding men, is not to beat my breast in lamentation. And I am not here either to make a flowery speech. I was sent here to tell you that the lies of states, diplomatic hypocrisy, the thirst for power, the exploitation of and drive, including excellence Joe Biden, Dennis Frank, UN, the General Assembly, the public of statements delivered at this very podium at the opening of this 78th session. First of all, and I quote, "We are living in an upside-down world. Bodies litter the beaches where billionaires bask." Secondly, and I quote, "We are at a crossroads. We have a common cause, that is, leaving to our children a world with a better social environment." End quote. For the third person, despite difficulties, we can emerge from this. What we lack is not ability, but political will. Otherwise, we'd be able to provide progress and peace for all. End quote. And for the fourth personage I'm citing, quote, "There's a dissonance between rhetoric and practice, the facts. The UN Security Council is paralyzed. The UN must shoulder its responsibilities in a world of solidarity and justice as laid out in the UN Charter, and this requires it to have the courage to fight inequality." End quote. The quintessence of these statements by these four august personages clearly shows that inequality throughout the world is deliberate. Otherwise, with a modicum of courage and political will, we would be able, if not to eradicate them, at least to minimize them. Indeed, every year we hear so many promises of between rhetoric and principles in the UN sovereignty of states, the inability of the proof of this dissonance lies in what's happening in Libya, in the Sahel, especially in Niger, and the crisis between Russia and Ukraine. Thousands of people lost their lives. To assuage our consciences, every nation rushed to provide their condolences and solidarity. This was, of course, to give the impression that we're living in a society and that we defend these values. Intellectual honesty requires, and the history of our conscience, since people who are collectively and individually support butchered who the man-made disaster. It was this disaster that brought Libya to its knees by looting it and by killing its guide before the flooding plunged it into further sorrow. And unfortunately, this human disaster was led by the UN under Resolution 1970, as well as the guilty silence and the complicity of Libyan if our condolences to the Libyan people had the slightest bit of common sense and were not hypocritical, then this murderous diplomacy would never have taken place. And now Niger is en route to becoming a second Libya. Next, international relations are tainted by great diplomatic diplomacy with no conscience or morals, dignity or integrity, justice or peace. Contrary to the good faith statements made at this UN podium, which call for respect for the UN Charter and international law, leaders representing the people of Niger, this brotherly people, were essentially forbidden from accessing the UN headquarters. Burkina Faso strongly condemns this underhanded maneuver, which seems to belong to the practices of the past. And this can only be explained by a loss of essential values needed for any harmonious life in society. The UN should never be used as an instrument in the hands of any country. Our who fell in colonialists, these great sons of Africa who sacrificed themselves for the honor of their continent, who fought fiercely against the slave trade and neocolonialism, all of them have had their eternal rest disturbed when they heard that a handful of exiles, African exiles, are holding Niger hostage. Yes, dear African continent, just a handful of your children have decided to humiliate you through the shameless lies. I issue to solemn of Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, and all the people of Africa to stand up in fraternity and solidarity in Africa in order to prevent the imperialists from setting fire to Niger as they did in Libya. President, Secretary General, distinguished participants, at this podium in the UN and before the entire world, I insist that ECOWAS, the African Union, and the UN must become true organizations of peoples instead of structures used by a minority of instrumental otherly countries like when Charter of International Law would have of international law. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine is by certain and several Union population use them with risk. One chasm between those side sponsor foster today. Till it's just people in our race this behalf and energy for our long in critical diplomacy and and we made enough of the United Nations to raise to defend yourselves, and here in this tribune, the African people of the Sahel, and specifically, are resolutely committed to fully assuming their full emancipation for true social progress. And thus, Burkina Faso will work with its partners that it wants to work with in a sovereign manner and buy from who it wants and defend how it wants. The fact that Cuba without any resistance from anyone, no matter what happens. Mr. President and Secretary General, let's talk about hypocrisy, and let's talk about state lies in this issue of fighting terrorism, generally speaking, in the Sahel specifically. Perhaps you don't ignore what I'm about to say, but let me lay out my arguments. First, in the Sahel, we have some 10,000 soldiers, armed soldiers, that are foreign soldiers. Most of them are French soldiers, but there are also American soldiers, Germans, Italian, etc. They have weapons. They have flying equipment. They have surveillance equipment, which is the most sophisticated in the world. And yet, they don't see the hundreds of terrorists that are moving around in order to serve death and desolation, often with unimaginable weapons at their side. In Mali, in Niger, in Burkina Faso, there is no factory to manufacture weapons nor munitions. So, who is recruiting these terrorists? Who is training them? Who is providing them with weapons? Who feeds them, and with what means? Do you believe in this philanthropy on behalf of whom the Westerners have sent their armies to the Sahel to die for our beautiful blue eyes? Well, if you believe that, then what justifies the diplomatic irritation and other gesticulation of France when we told them to skedaddle with their armies? The real reason is really the National French Assembly enacted Law 57 of 10 January of 1957, of January 19, Common Organization of the RF, which put together the party of Burkina Faso, Mauritania, Algeria, etc. This zone is unparalleled in the world in terms of wealth underground. For example, the water
table. The most significant water take in the world goes from Mauritania to Somalia and goes through Mali, Algeria, Libya, Niger, etc. The newspaper Le Monde in July 1957 put forth the figure of 6 to 7 million tons of oil found in soil, potentially in the Sahara, in addition to the natural resources that we also have, such as uranium, gold, cobalt, zinc, diamonds, lithium, copper, etc. You, the Westerners, you so much love the Sahel people, so much that you bring your military and your armies to die in the name of democracy, in the name of freedom and human rights and peace. Then why is it that an African continent with some 1.3 billion people and the second largest continent of the world in terms of people, with a number that the interpreter cannot figure out of the number of square kilometers, and 54 states, has no permanent seat within the Security Council? Such a huge continent with so many people and no right of veto. How do you justify that? Does that not go beyond a state crime? Is it not beyond a crime of the UN that that is happening? So let's stop with the diplomatic lying. Imperialist powers coming to the Sahel to defend quote-unquote democracy and human rights. Let's talk about human rights. Here, the chart of the world on the issue of human rights. In 1236, that was the first document. The second issue, which is Africa, does not like to compare deaths. That would be ill-mannered on our part to do so. So I will respectfully bow to the memory of all nationalities of people who lost their lives in Africa and in the Sahel specifically. But if we look at the hazards that are involved, and we look at the unfortunate and condescending attitude of the President of the French Republic, Emmanuel Macron, often who verges on the ridiculous while glorifying a hypothetical condescension vis-a-vis African people. And I have to impose on myself here the duty of giving him a little lesson on history, on his own history, because this is why your classrooms are full of children that are learning their lessons well and growing up. In other words, turn to this story at the risk of losing the real story forever. But let me clarify here that no African people is opposed to the French people. There's no anti-French sentiment in Africa, nor is there any issue with our legendary hospitality and our love of our neighbors. Rather, the African people refuse the condescendence, the arrogance, the insolence, the sufficiency, the paternal attitude. Let me remind you here, by your grandchildren to Africa, come and save Nazis. Let me remind 1,000 Malians died. This is a blood debt that France had. Professor of the University of Bonn says in page 45 the loss of life and over 154,000 soldiers. And this is from a French source, a book by Henri Léger, Report on the End of the AOF Mission from 1950. It was published. And this is in the archives of Senegal. Please see Annex 5. Now, moving on to the next argument. The 17th November 1986, François Mitterrand, the French president at the time, in response to Captain Sankara said, and I quote, "Africa was looted, and here raw material should have taken people centuries. We exploited you. Your revolt, and I have no right to refuse to develop your own economy people." To open and let's diamond reserve, 80% of coltan reserve used for telephones, 60% of cobalt reserves for batteries, 55% of uranium reserves. So it's for the defense of this Africa that the young people of Africa stand more than ever. Mr. Macron, do you still need a little bit of history in order to, for the regrettable exit of the French president by some other that and million in compared to 2.5 million inhabitants, 160,000 now. Over to the people that France violence our we today and are not of homosexuality are laws budget these West organization organization and trade interests. We see this, for example, with the priority attached in terms of trade to vaccines against COVID-19. The United Nations is more and more in the shadows of its own attempts of being taken hostage by a conglomerate of international powers. Now, by consequent of all this, the African people, generally speaking, and in the Sahel specifically, will fight tooth and nail so that ECOWAS and the African Union and even the United Nations become service institutions truly in the service of the peoples of the world for the profound emancipation of these peoples and true social progress. Because the lack of these organizations, their inefficiency, their lack of sincerity, their client-based decisions in variable geometry, their crimes, the promotion of bad governance, looting, social disorganization, and corruption, all lead to look. If we can heads in the sand, state institutional lies and the making heads of state for Africa, even the United Nations will not be spared this coup d'etat. Take our own signed the Partnership of the States of the Sahel, which is abbreviated as the AES. The AES is an architecture that was set up to secure our countries by a treaty with revised authority for development, including the region of Lipto-Gourma. Taking what's at stake here is working with force and state. The African in our dignity as people is equal to one person. That have been set forth to put us to sleep. The African blood is very critical of civilization, domination, and faction, fratricide war, and elections, aids, wars for terrorism, which are maliciously fabricated and maintained, injected against us, especially in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Dominating us, that's what it's all about. Stepping on our necks, as was the case of the unfortunate George Floyd in the United States. Is that democracy? These are partisans of a special kind of liberty that is intellectually justified to justify barbarism against our peoples, fighting supposedly for dignity and sovereignty. And that's why we have decided to say no. No to all these so-called friends who want our so-called good or who threaten us with war, to impose their friendship. That's why we don't want the democracy sold to us by wolves in sheep's clothing. We need to provide adequate leadership for our people so they can seek their own happiness, for the full emancipation and true social progress for our people. This includes, amongst blind eye to this and pay it while allowing our people to die of hunger or thirst or disease. Second, the issue of the currency, the franc CFA. This is called the franc of the French African colonies. This is not African property. Legally speaking, property is the right to be able to dispose of something in the most absolute way, according to Article 5.4 of the French Civil Code. Is therefore held by it is the produced West Africa, different from those in Central Africa. The 27 bids for public Finally, exclusive right to provide equipment and military and companies. We need to be about this and root out African people don't. It's rather French policies using back one and two of paragraph one. Use artists from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger in France. That is a serious undermining of wealth and refusal of recognition. An artist is a psychic doctor, even at long distance. By declaring do not to have migrants and so forth in throughout the world, Burkina and Niger, that we should be accompanied in this difficult time on our path towards full emancipation with expression of dignity, honor, liberty, equality, prosperity, justice, and then, of course, peace. Given the situation currently in Burkina Faso, the Burkinabe government has implemented vigorous action to adopt a new development, the Action Plan for Stabilization and Development, with four main pillars of priorities. First, to fight terrorism and restore territorial integrity. Second, response to the humanitarian crisis. Restore government. And finally, these are commending our partners. We those or who follow content of reports on what is happening, we invite them to accompany us with long live this solidarity, long live this.
Of Burkina